Just give you a little background. The International Association for Research and Wealth has been sponsoring conferences on measurement topics, I guess, since about 1948. And one of the things we like to do is look at cutting edge issues in related to national accounts and productivity measurement. So this was a conference that fit right in to our objectives. And so with that, let me hand it over to Rebecca. And again, welcome to the conference.
Thank you, Marshall, and also to Andrew Sharp from the IARIW for agreeing to co-host this conference with us. It's good to see everybody, not through a screen, and thank you very much for coming. So we have an exciting 2 days ahead of us with a collection of papers and discussions that I think will push forward our understanding of intangible assets and growth. So thanks very much to the scientific committee, including Sally Srinivasan, Mary Omani, Josh Martin, Leonard Nakamura, and Carol Corrado for selecting such an excellent bunch of papers. And we're covering issues around the definition and measurement of intangibles, intangibles and productivity, their contributions to growth, and also special topics around management and organizational capital and on valuing data. So we've been back and forth a bit about the title of this conference. Was it going to be Intangible Capital, Intangible Capitals, Intangible Assets? And I think it was Bart van Ark who ruled out capitals on the grounds or on grammatical reasons, I think was the
Good for Bart.
So we went for assets, basically wanting to make clear the plurality of intangibles, their many different characteristics, and also their dominance in modern production structures. So to those who have contributed a paper on the program, please consider submitting to the special issue of the Review of Income and Wealth that will come out of this conference. The deadline is end of February 2022, and the usual refereeing processes will apply, and a selection of the papers will be published in the special issue. In addition to the support of the IARIW and ESCoE, we're grateful for the support of the ONS, King's College London, and also the Economic and Social Research Council, who support our work on management and productivity, as well as our partnership with the Productivity Institute. So before we get started, I would also like to thank Mercy Keener, who has basically organized this event almost single-handedly. We have some international participants, in particular today, participating virtually, but I'm very delighted that many of you are actually able to be here in person to discuss the issues and to catch up with one another. There are some aspects of conferences that, they just don't transfer to Zoom, but we do still have relatively high rates of infection around us. So we would very much encourage you to wear a face covering if you can, and also to please make ample use of the sanitizing stations dotted around the place. So just before I hand over to Mary Omani to introduce our first keynote, I wanted to mention that we have a walking tour scheduled for Saturday AM, I think about 11 o'clock, aptly entitled How the City Got Rich. And I think we have a few spaces left. So if you are interested in participating in that, please let Mary know today. And with that, I'll hand over to Mary.
Okay, welcome. So it's my great pleasure to introduce our first keynote speaker, Dan Sichel. I guess for anybody who's been working on intangibles, Dan hardly needs an introduction. He was part of the pioneering work with Carol Corrado and Chuck Holton on measuring intangibles. Dan is currently at Wellesley College, and prior to that was at the Federal Reserve Board. And I guess when we're looking at over time, Dan has been involved in a lot of research, but in addition to the key paper on measuring intangibles, when I look back over time, another key paper with Owen and Sichel on information technology was very well cited. And Dan now is also working on aspects of the digital transformation, cloud computing, So he's been at the forefront of research on the modern economy throughout his career. So we're looking forward to a very interesting talk. I'll hand over to Dan in a moment. Dan will talk for about 40 minutes, then we'll have a Q&A after that.
Thanks very much, Mary. Here we go. Okay. Delighted to be here. Give me just a second to do a quick iPad adjustment here. Okay. Delighted. Okay, I just making sure it's good. All right. Really happy to be here. Wonderful to see everybody. First in-person conference I've been to since I can't really remember. And it's just so nice to be here and see everybody. And already have had some nice conversations with people in just a way that you just can't do on Zoom. So today, want to talk about intangibles. I titled this How Far We've Come and the Road Ahead. So some thoughts on kind of how we got to where we are and some thoughts on where we might go. More on that in a second. But first, let me just thank Rebecca, Andrew, Mary, Mercy, the scientific committee, everybody who put this together. It is a fabulous set of papers that have been put together. And this is just going to be, I think, both being in person and also the set of papers, it's just going to be an incredibly wonderful couple of days. And I'm really excited about it. So on to intangibles. Yeah, this dates me a little bit. So what I want to do is talk a little bit about kind of mostly measurement, how we got to where we are, a little bit about economic implications. I think Jonathan Haskell is going to talk much more about that tomorrow. And then talk again, as I said, about kind of the road ahead, maybe with a particular focus on NSOs, statistical agencies, and how might researchers and statistical agencies most effectively collaborate to further work on intangibles. And then just for fun, to think about kind of very far ahead kinds of things and also a bit of a look back. And of course, the image here dates me. This, some of you will know this, some of you may not. This was a 1990 release, MC Hammer, You Can't Touch This. He was obviously a music visionary, but also an intangibles visionary, because, you know, 1990, that was really just a little bit before everything got going. And he kind of got the vibe that, you know, how should we think about this? I also put that up because, of course, by dating me, you know, I'm really going to do kind of a retrospective. I'm not really going to talk about cutting edge research that's being done. That's really what we're going to hear about in the next couple of days. So it's really more of a retrospective. And again, dating myself, it's really a retrospective very much from kind of my perspective, my experience, much more on the aggregate side of intangibles research as compared to the firm level side. So just, you know, kind of wanted to put that out there with how I'm approaching this and what you're gonna hear from me. Okay, so reaching back to the paper that I did with Carol Corrado and Chuck Holton. So we developed a classification scheme or a typology for intangibles, and that's what's shown here. I think this is very familiar to everybody here. The one thing I added here is I put in red the categories that largely have been incorporated into national accounts by statistical agencies, NSOs. The ones in black, of course, those that haven't. So already kind of gives an idea of some areas where research has made it to official statistics and some areas where research hasn't. Much more on that coming up. So not advancing for me. Somebody lend a hand. Not sure why I'm either pointing in the wrong place. All right, we'll go in just a second here. I can tell tales of going up to York yesterday to visit with Nick Olton. I have slides on my iPad here, but those aren't. Yep, we'll get going in just a second. Can talk about the lovely mural. Should be. Oh, we got it. Excellent, excellent, brilliant. Thank you. Okay, so again, coming back to that classification scheme, this is a picture very familiar. I just pulled this from Intanvest's website. The red line, of course, shows the investment rate. Business investment is a share of GDP for the full set of intangible assets in that prior typology. And the blue line here shows the tangible asset investment rate. And of course, it's the familiar story of the rising share of intangible capital and the diminishing share of tangible capital. And with the interesting crossover in the 1990s when intangible capital, according to the classification scheme I showed you just a second ago, became more important than tangible capital. So really intangibles, I mean, again, for this audience, I don't think anybody needs any convincing. It's the present, it's the future. It's crucial to develop the best measures possible of these types of assets so that we can really fully understand what's happening in the economy. So just as intangible assets have grown, so too has research on intangible assets. So I did Google Scholar counts of papers that include the phrase intangible assets going back to 1990, the year of MC Hammer's breakout hit. And I also struggled with what to call it, whether to do intangible assets, intangible capital. I did not try intangible capitals. I didn't think that was going to show so much. But we can see here this very rapid growth in research on intangible capital. And interestingly, a bit of a topping over and dip in recent years, but shows that the research community has really gotten onto the topic. Now, maybe more so for this group, we might think intangible assets, that's going to cover a lot of stuff well beyond the kinds of topics that this conference is about. So I did a refined search looking for both intangible assets as a keyword and also national income, that being shown on the black line with the scale over on the right. So a couple things that are interesting. One, of course, the number of papers is much lower. We could probably do a count of people in this room and probably account for a decent number of those papers. It is interesting, though, the pattern is much the same. So the growth, the rising interest in this type of research, much the same, whether one does the narrower search or the broader search. And of course, the ultimate intent of doing this better measurement is to try to understand how do intangibles affect all dimensions of economic activity. And I started a list here. I kind of thought of this as the literature is on the effects of intangibles on either X, Y, or Z. I started a list here. I didn't identify specific papers, but again, many people in this room who've written on these topics, whole range of topics on productivity, scalability of production, profits, wages, labor share I didn't put on, but another category, global value chains. And of course, the list goes on. Just all of those papers that we just saw that have been written on a wide range of topics about how intangibles have affected all dimensions of economic activity. And ultimately, really, this is the goal. I mean, the measurement, I find it fascinating and intriguing and love geeking out on it. But of course, the ultimate goal is to get better measures so we can better understand how the economy is functioning, how the economy is changing, how digitization is changing the economy, and so on. So coming back to the measurement, here's just putting together the pieces, the red line being the intangible investment rate, total intangibles as an investment rate, the black line being the Google Scholar count for papers including both intangible investment and national income. And what's interesting here is actually research has grown faster than intangible assets have. You might be concerned that I have right and left scale, even if you take account of the right and left scales, the research is still growing faster. So that seems like a good thing, that there's a lot of interest in this interest in this category. And it's not just researchers who, kind of academic researchers who've made progress, but national statistical offices also have made progress. This is the line we looked at. This is another line from the Intan Invest website. It's US. I should have gotten the UK line. I just got this one because it was so easy to pull from Intan Invest, which is the investment rate for intangibles that are included in US national accounts in official statistics. So less than, a lower share than the one we looked at before, but similar growth: software, R&D, entertainment, and literary and artistic originals. And we've seen, in a sense, a lot of progress here too, because statistical agencies have started incorporating rapidly growing intangible assets. So considerable progress there as well. And I put together a table to just kind of recount the timing of that process, thinking about software, R&D, and ELA, or entertainment and literary and artistic originals. Thanks to Josh Martin and Paul Schreier, who helped me out with the UK and the OECD dates. But so for the software, kind of all around the same time, late 1990s, early 2000s, depending on the country, when that got folded in. And that got folded in really because of the intense interest in information technology. And I think it was more about that than a recognition that national accounts need to be paying more attention to intangible capital. But then a little more than a decade later, by 2013, there really was a recognition that intangible capital is a very important thing to be focusing on. And by 2013, 2014, research and development and then ELA was largely brought into account. With, again, some variations across countries, some countries that got an earlier start, some that got a later start. So that's kind of, the last time that there'd been a major step to incorporate more intangibles into national accounts. And that seems like really good progress. But I think it's interesting that the lags from research on these categories to incorporation have been on the long side. So here's a little bit on that. So here again, in the same picture that we looked at before, intangible rate of those assets, the investment rate of assets incorporated in national accounts. And black line here shows roughly the time of early research on software and how one might think of software in a national accounts context. I cited a paper that Steve Oler and I did a long time ago, back in the 1990s. There was work by Neil Gondal, Eric Brynjolfsson, others who are also thinking about software at that time. But that was kind of the beginnings, I think, the first time, roughly the timing of when software kind of became a research focus with kind of a national accounts idea. And it took about 5 years from that first research to when Bureau of Economic Analysis in the US first incorporated software into the accounts as a capitalized asset. So that was about a 5-year lag. For R&D and the broader categories of intangibles, even a longer lag. I might date the early research on this to Leonard's paper on intangibles from about 2003. There was a conference held at the Federal Reserve in 2002 on measuring capital in the new economy, when Carol and Chuck and I first presented the first paper that we did together. So kind of thinking of that 2002, 2003 time is when there was really kind of a big research focus on intangibles as a category that warrant attention. And of course, given the date from before, it was about an 11-year lag until statistical agencies got sufficiently comfortable with the data and methodology to incorporate intangibles. So by that metric, you'd think the lags are perhaps getting longer rather than shorter, sample of 2, but nonetheless. And just for fun to take a further look back, there's an argument that the lags are really even much longer than that. So here's a paper by John Kendrick, published in Research and Income and Wealth. titled Treatment of Intangible Resources as Capital. So this was John Kendrick's effort to think hard about intangible assets. And that was published in 1972. He got involved in a lot of debates with Ed Dennison, Dale Jorgensen about measuring capital, how to do growth accounting. And I think really his work on intangible capital kind of just fell by the wayside. Although it's a really interesting paper and actually foreshadows much of what we've all done in the last 20 years. So from that perspective, maybe it took the profession and the measurement community even a bit longer to kind of get on the intangibles train. And just for fun, we could look back even further. So I did another Google search looking at books and magazines in the English language and how many times the phrase intangible capital appeared in those books and magazines going back to 1800. Thank you, Google. And so here's the story. And if we start with the region over on the right, where the blue arrow is, if you didn't see the earlier part of the picture, you would see the same sort of pattern that we saw before with counts of in Google Scholar of papers with the run up and then starting in 1990, right about there where the arrow is, and on over, you'd see the same uptrend. And if I only showed you that part of the picture, it would look much the same, not surprisingly. Mentions in books and magazines, roughly tracking papers in Google Scholar. But what's interesting is what happened before. And there was a whole earlier period, which might be interesting to dig into a bit, in the 1920s and 1930s. The first time that the phrase new economy got widespread use, at least in America, when there was a lot of interest in intangible capital, and that was appearing a lot. And then, of course, that faded with the Depression, Second World War, and so on. But again, a lot of antecedents to the sort of work that we're doing today. And I didn't go back and start reading, tracing down those earlier sites, but I suspect that there would be some interesting things there. I suspect there'd be plenty of things that wouldn't be interesting and would be very particular to the time, but I also suspect that there's quite a bit there. And from that perspective, it actually took the profession and statistical agencies quite a while to get focused on the importance of carefully and thoughtfully measuring intangible capital. All right, so that's the kind of story that might make us all feel just a little bit sad. I think there are arguments that the lags are getting shorter now and that we're actually doing a better job. As an outsider from across the Atlantic, I look at some of the things ESCoE's done, and it looks just really innovative and kind of accelerating the process. So, noticed recently ONS's adoption of regional, of kind of nowcasts of regional GDP, which I think was based on ESCoE work that was not done that long ago. And that seemed like a wonderful collaboration and kind of a speeding up of this process from research to implementation. There are also a lot of statistical agencies that now are really focused on trying to do more to incorporate real-time data, or big data as it's sometimes called, particularly with a focus on price indexes, but also more broadly on measures of GDP. And I think that effort, I've been involved in a National Academy of Sciences effort in the US with kind of trying to think about how that might work better for the consumer price index. I think that effort will have some beneficial spillovers, because I think that's very much about how to use novel, innovative sources of data and how to more quickly bring those into official measures. And so I'm hopeful that there'll be some kind of lessons, greater flexibility, and an ability to more rapidly take things from the research community into official statistics. Obviously, that needs to be done carefully and with thought, as it would be in any of the leading statistical agencies. But maybe that process is getting faster than 11 years, or if we reach back to the 1920s, a decades-long lag for that kind of work to happen. There is, of course, plenty more work to do. Here's a picture of putting together these intangible investment rates, where the black line are the assets typically incorporated into national accounts today. And the red line would be the full set of the full typology of assets I showed at the beginning, with all of the categories that Carol and Chuck and I initially laid out in that first paper. And there's obviously a big gap. So there are important categories of intangible assets that are not typically now included in national accounts. So I'm going to come back to the measurement aspects of that in some of the specifics and papers and research and directions in a second. But I wanted to do a little bit of an interlude to just highlight an issue that I really just saw pop up in the last year or two, based on some work that Sam Cordham's done that I think is just worth pondering for a moment. So to set that up, okay, standard approaches to measuring intangibles. There's the way that it's done in the accounting world, which is quite different, obviously, than how most of us would think about it. There are then the national accounting or economic approaches, typically either measuring expenditures or costs, work really well, really practical. There can be arguments about whether they correctly identify value, but are the practical kind of implementable approaches. There's also, right, the stock market approach. Bob Hall wrote a paper about 20 years ago. Interesting way of getting at value, but of course, very volatile and probably includes a lot of things that as measurement people, we would not want to include in a measure of intangible capital. So makes sense to me that statistical agencies, NSOs, would be sticking with the expenditure or cost approach in the spirit of real-time data, big data, new novel data sources. Seems to me very valuable to look more into what the accounting world is doing and to be thinking about other types of data not traditionally used for national accounts that could be used to improve measurement, particularly of some of the categories of intangible capital that haven't yet been incorporated into accounts. All right, so here's the Sam Cordham topic that again, a brief interlude, I just wanted to slip in. So the typical approach, and now I'm getting a bit into, I think, things more that Jonathan's going to talk about tomorrow, but typical approach in thinking about implications of intangible capital for economic growth or growth accounting are to think of intangible capital as a separate type of capital good, as if it is rivalrous. It is a capital good comparable to trucks, computers, or other types of tangible capital. It's just intangible. And so it gets reflected in growth accounting as a separate type of capital. And that's absolutely the way I've always done it. Very comfortable with that, very familiar with that approach. That's the standard approach. But Sam Cordham and co-author raised the question of, well, what about if intangible capital is non-rival? Think about the David Romer kind of endogenous growth models, where an idea, right, the epitome of intangible capital, can be used by anybody, anywhere, at the same time, in any place, without diminishing anyone else's ability to use it. So if one takes that idea really seriously, that not all, but a lot of intangible capital really is non-rivalrous and really can be simultaneously used by somebody on that side of the room and somebody on that side of the room, with one person's use not diminishing the other person's use, that might take you in a little bit of a different direction. And that's really the question that Cordham and Eaton ask. And so here's an example to make it a little more concrete. In olden days, right, how would we think of software? If Microsoft developed a new version of Microsoft Office, we would of course think of that as intangible investment, because it's own account for Microsoft. That would be own account investment in software development and so on. And we'd want to be thinking of that as investment. We would also think, though, of the purchase of Office by businesses as investment, as indeed investment in intangible capital. All right, well, today Microsoft has a different business model. A lot of software distributed through the cloud has a different business model. So today, right, many people lease essentially Microsoft Office, where you pay a subscription fee. And those lease payments probably are showing up as services rather than investment in capital. And in the cloud version, if you think about software as a service, program like Salesforce, again, companies use that by subscription and are paying fees to the company. And this kind of new subscription approach to software raises the question of whether should payments or purchases of software or other intangible assets that maybe are non-rivalrous, should we really be thinking of that as investment? Or should we be thinking of it as Microsoft made the investment, Salesforce made the investment, and the royalty or rent payments are just the return on their investment? And is there some problem with counting Ford Motors Company's purchase of Microsoft Office licenses as investment? And so raises a really interesting question. I think if you took David Romer's idea really seriously about non-rivalrous assets, you might change around a way that you would do growth accounting. And Cordham and Eaton do that in a paper. And it would have really important implications for thinking about the size of intangible capital in national accounts and for how you do growth accounting. I have to confess, I was a little reluctant to go to this topic today because I'm not really in my own mind quite sure of what the right way to think about it is, but it strikes me as an important question for all of us to think about and really try to come to terms with what is the right way to think about how to incorporate intangible capital or certain types of intangible capital into a growth accounting framework and think about and model their effect on the economy. Again, as I said, I'm not quite sure the answer, but as I saw Sam's work presented, it struck me as an important topic for all of us to at least think about. And if the conclusion is don't want to go there, get to that conclusion by having worked it through and thought about it carefully. Okay, so coming back more to measurement and road ahead, let me say a little bit about what I think researchers can do to help statistical agencies, and then a little bit of my thoughts as an outsider on what statistical agencies might want to be doing. So this isn't actually the road in front of my house, but maybe some shades of that. So the work ahead is really hard. I mean, the reason that in that first slide there were a lot of categories in black rather than in red is because the work is really hard, and getting it right, which statistical agencies have to do, is very challenging. So what are the remaining categories within the classification scheme that I showed you at the beginning? Databases, non-scientific product development, brand equity, firm-specific resources. As I said, this is hard. Martin and Beba, right, have a paper in this conference that highlights a number of these challenges and what it is that makes it hard. So we're going to have a chance to hear more about that. Flag here, I'm going to, in the next few minutes, flag a lot of papers that are going to be presented at this conference that touch on exactly the set of issues that are in my mind, the key issues ahead. So progress is being made on these categories. In terms of data, value of data, there's a paper we're going to see here, Devant and Mushkadiani, on value of data that I'm really excited to see. Not on the program, but Jonathan and co-authors, Jonathan Haskell and co-authors, recently did this very nice paper trying to put some numbers on value of databases, and it's a great paper. Take a look at it. But bottom line, databases, valuing database, it's a really big deal. So it's going to be great to talk some about valuing data in the next couple of days. Advertising, another category where we're going to see a really interesting paper by Ernie Berndt and co-author, highlighting the changing role of advertising and thinking about how we might get a better handle on that. And then there's a host of other examples, papers appearing in this Congress and other in this conference for other categories. So for organizational or managerial capital, I won't run through them all, but again, just wonderful set of papers that we're going to get a chance to talk about in the next few days, touching on this category. My read is that statistical agencies still see managerial organizational capital as conceptually a little bit abstract, and some questions about what data and methodology to use to measure. And I think that's why we haven't seen that incorporated. But I think we've got a great set of papers to push that conversation forward. Other key elements in terms of full measurement of intangibles and national accounts would be prices, deflators, and depreciation rates. These are really hard. In the 2 early papers I did with Carol and Chuck, quotes in blue, we laid out, getting price deflators, converting nominals to reals, it's really hard. Not much is known about depreciation rates, really hard. So there's been some progress, not as much, I think, as on measuring nominal quantity side of things. Carol Corrado has a very nice paper, or she sent me, I should be careful here, she sent me some slides from a paper. I don't want to promise that she's got a paper to distribute. Maybe she does, maybe she doesn't. I've got to be careful there. But she sent me some slides, and she's got some really nice work developing price indexes for intangibles. Leonard Nakamura too. We're going to see that in the next couple of days with a really nice paper on thinking about prices of intangibles and what's happened to the price deflator. Depreciation, another really hard question. We're going to see a paper. We're going to see a paper here on depreciation, and sort of a little more about thinking about implications of depreciation for flows of capital services. And there's also the work that Wendy Lee and Bronwyn Hall have done on R&D and so on. So there's been some work. It's really hard. It's hard to get a handle on these things. It is incredibly important. So I haven't done a paper on this because I just haven't, I haven't been able to figure out what to do to move things forward, but it's an incredible important thing to work on. I am hopeful. I know in the US, there's considerable kind of activity around at Bureau of Economic Analysis around rethinking depreciation rates more generally, given that depreciation rates used in the accounts are really from the Holton Wyckoff work that is now about 40 years old. So I know there's a lot of thinking about that within BEA, and perhaps some effective international collaboration. Perhaps as part of that work, some additional work and creative work could be done on the intangible capital side of that as well. So my take on what the research community can do to try to help national statistical NSOs, statistical agencies, really, I think requires researchers taking the perspective of statistical agencies and the constraints that statistical agencies face. So my take on what do statistical agencies need? Well, they need a replicable methodology. They need something where data are available. If it's a proprietary data source that nobody can get, to which there's very limited access, that might be really interesting research, but it's not going to work for incorporation in national accounts. Needs, I think, maybe this is from a US perspective, right? Need a consensus on methodology in the measurement community. All of us need to have some general sense of, yeah, here's a good way to do it, rather than here are 18 different possible ways you could do it. And then what I like to think of as the satellite account test, which is, can you take the work in a paper and actually say, here's what it would look like in national accounts. Here's how, if this were incorporated according to a particular methodology, here's a satellite account that would show what things look like. So if researchers can do those things, it makes it much easier, I think, for statistical agencies to adopt. I've never worked in a statistical agency. I did spend many years at the Federal Reserve and had a lot of contact with statistical agencies. I'm on the advisory committee of Bureau of Economic Analysis. So I've never actually been inside, but I've been close enough on the outside to have a sense that these are things that as researchers we can do that would help move things forward in terms of getting a wider set of intangibles brought into official statistics. And kind of stating the obvious, more collaboration is always valuable. And I think in different countries, different statistical agencies, collaboration works in different ways, sometimes perhaps more effectively than other times in other places. From an outsider's perspective, again, from the US, I see what ESCO has been doing. I see the collaboration between ESCO and ONS, and it just seems like that's been terrifically effective in creating collaboration between researchers and statistical agencies, and work from the UK Productivity Institute as well in a similar vein. So those seem like models for collaboration. I am sure here I've gotten myself into trouble by not mentioning other things that I should have, but given that we're here, and so on, it just, these are ones that have really kind of caught my eye in recent years as effective models of collaboration. And also coming back to a theme I mentioned a minute ago, statistical agencies, NSOs, I think are going to have to get at these harder to measure intangibles. I think you're going to need to be more flexible, more willing to use novel, unconventional or non-traditional types of data. That's been a big theme in work on modernizing the CPI, modernizing GDP, bringing in real-time data, bringing in novel data sources. A lot of that happened during COVID for all the obvious reasons. And I think that's really started a lot of momentum. I think that's really important work. And again, different situations in different countries, different statistical agencies, but at least in the US, it's a culture shift for statistical agencies to do that, because the people inside the agencies are trained to use a certain kind of data, to have a certain set of standards for how to make decisions about when to incorporate things. And I think to make progress on intangibles, there's going to need to be some flexibility and some willingness to do some things that haven't been done in the past. The economy's changing, measurement methodologies needs to change too, to keep up with that. And of course, there's going to be, bottom bullet, some hard thinking that needs to be done about what should actually be in official measures of GDP or the CPI, and what should be in a satellite account, because these are important topics to have an official set of statistics on, but not part of headline indexes. And there's going to be some hard thinking to be done about that as well. Okay, so now let's look even further ahead and think about expanding the asset boundary. And just for fun, we'll take a look way back, even further back than 1800 as well, with thinking about some categories of intangibles. So expanding the asset boundary, thinking very far ahead. So in a way, the work gets even harder here as the categories get further away from what's traditionally been thought of as national accounts. And this mostly comes down to expanding the asset boundary. And again, stating the obvious, right? A lot of recent economic activity is focused on the knowledge economy, focused on digitization, focused on intangibles. I think that's raised concerns in the public and in some parts of the business community that official statistics are falling behind and don't correctly or accurately reflect what's happening in the economy, which of course can undermine credibility of official statistics. And so then we get to this whole thing about, well, how should we expand asset boundaries to maybe more fully reflect some of those developments? So a number of directions that are interesting to think about that go beyond the kind of Corrado, Holton, Sichel typology. One would be public intangibles. So thinking about intangibles created by and perhaps controlled by governments, either local or national governments. There's a lot of work that's been done here. I just pulled one site from work that Carol Corrado and co-authors have done, thinking about how one might make progress on measuring public intangibles. Another really interesting category, economic statistics. What's the value of economic statistics? There's a really important government intangible. And there was the recent ESCoE survey on valuing this. I almost took the survey and then decided, maybe I shouldn't, because I'm a little outside the UK ONS world. So I started and then I chickened out and stopped. But But in thinking about that, it did put in mind, and a quick bit of editorializing, did put in mind one caution that I'd offer in thinking about how to measure economic statistics, which is following on and like work that like Eric Brynjolfsson and Kevin Fox and Erwin Dewart have done, doing these online surveys to try to value Facebook or Google or other things. The approach being to ask people, how much would we have to pay you to not be able to use these services for a month? Or how much would you pay to have access to these services rather than not have access to these services? So I've always been struck and kind of spun in my head a little bit about how to think about what we learned from those surveys. And we certainly learned some really interesting things, but it struck me as a little bit of the water and diamonds problem, in that if you were to ask how much would you pay to not have access to water for a month, I think we'd all pay a great deal. Same thing if you asked about food, I think we'd all pay a great deal. And so if you're asking about how much people would pay to not have access to anything as compared to how much would you pay for one more unit of the item, we get a really different value. And of course, with things like national economic statistics, Facebook, Google, there isn't any natural way to say, what does one more unit represent? So that's a really hard path to go down. But nonetheless, if we do ask the question of what's total value, we get a really interesting number, but I'm just not sure that it's comparable to what we think of as GDP measuring. It just seems like it's a different metric. And I think if we used that approach and we applied it to every item in GDP and asked people, what would you pay not to have access to this item in GDP, not to have access to that item in GDP, and we took those valuations and added them up, I am confident they would add up to much more than GDP. So I just think there's some thinking and work to be done on how we interpret what we learned from those surveys. The surveys are really interesting, and I think in many regards can provide very valuable numbers. But in terms of comparing them to GDP statistics, I think I want to urge a little bit of caution there. All right, so back to expanding the asset boundary. Social capital, kind of stretching over into broader topics of well-being. Vast topic that goes from kind of focused efforts of thinking about beyond GDP and what do we need to do to go beyond GDP, to thinking about how we might value things like trust within a society. Diane Coyle has a paper on that we're going to hear in the next couple days. I also just wanted to put in a plug at this point for a conference coming up next week on productivity and well-being, since we're talking about well-being and social capital, that Andrew Sharp, Bart Van Ark, and I are organizing. Two-day conference next Tuesday and Wednesday, all online. If that's a topic of interest to you, go to the Productivity Institute's webpage, look for events, you can find it. We'd be delighted to have others join in if anybody else is interested in that. So just a quick plug for, if you didn't get enough today and tomorrow, it's a different topic, but more coming next week. Other ways to think about expanding the asset boundary. Open source software, hugely important topic, very hard to think about how to measure. Carol Robbins and co-author have a paper they're going to do. It's a wonderful paper that they're going to do that talks about some ways of thinking about valuation there. And then really, if we're thinking about expanding the intangibles boundary, probably get into turf battles here, but right, really much of the work on trying to value free goods, Google, Facebook, Google Maps, Google Search, all the rest, right? I mean, that's just consumption of intangibles. And so really, that's kind of connected to all of this same literature. And as I think we think about expanding the asset category for, say, business intangibles, it's going to overlap with those ideas of consumption of intangibles, and maybe some useful back and forth and spillovers both ways in terms of measurement techniques. So really interesting and hard topics on expanding the asset boundary. Some really important things to be done there. All right, and then one more category I wanted to talk about that's near and dear to my heart, which is household intangible capital. So we think typically of households as consumers. And so as consumers of goods and services, and maybe in an expanding world, consumer of intangible items. Again, all of the things that we get through the internet often for free. But we also can think of households as producers, and we can think of households as producers of a particular type of intangible capital. So here I'm doing a little pitch, taking advantage of having the platform here to do a little pitch for some work that I've done with Eric von Hippel, where we focused on the production of intangible capital by households. And we could call it household innovation or household R&D. A canonical example would be, say, somebody, an engineer, has a child who's diabetic, true story, has a child who's diabetic and developed an artificial pancreas, which it required merging an iPhone with a small Raspberry Pi computer and with the appropriate medical devices to create an artificial pancreas. So did this on his own time, wanted to do it for his diabetic child, but then put the instructions on the internet and made it available to anyone for free. So here's somebody who just created a really valuable intangible asset. And then just as so much on the internet is distributed for free, distributed it for free. So we did some work to try to think about, well, how important is this category of intangible assets? And as you can imagine, the measurement issues are daunting and you have to make a lot of assumptions to pull numbers together. But when we did that, we found if you think about the annual flow of investment of new creation of household intangible capital, and you thought about the income flow from the stock of existing household intangible capital, and you added it to GDP, you'd get nearly 0.5% of GDP. So our point was just, here's a category of intangible assets that hasn't gotten a lot of attention because we're all accustomed to thinking of households as consumers rather than as producers, that we thought warranted some additional attention. And I just wanted to say that if we want to look further back in time, thinking kind of economic history, that this type of intangible capital seems really important. So credit to Nick Olton for the particular historical examples here. But when Isaac Newton developed calculus, started working on gravity, he was not employed. He was not working for General Electric or Bell Labs or any other research consortium. He was taking some time. I think there was some kind of a plague outbreak. So he went home after finishing his BA before he went on to get a master's degree. And while he was home on his own, he did a little household innovation. And he came up with calculus and the beginnings of theory of gravity and a variety of other things. So if you look back to pre-industrial revolution, probably household innovation, households or individuals as producers of innovation of R&D, producers of important intangible assets, I think really important if one wants to go back and really try to trace the role and imprint of innovation going back in time. I think we have to think about household innovation. Christian Huygens is another example. Didn't have a job, came from a very wealthy family, so was able to not have a job. But while not having a job, invented the pendulum clock. Another nice piece there. Another really nice example of household development of an important intangible asset or innovation coming from within a household. And if you don't measure household intangible capital, you're going to miss innovation coming from that sector. So just wanted to put in a plug as we think about expanding the asset category of one other direction that we might go. Okay, so that kind of brings me on my tour through both kind of my perspective on where we've been, some of the things that might make sense to do going forward. Tried to give a little bit of kind of a teaser of what's coming in the conference in the next couple of days. As I said, the collection of papers is just wonderful and touches on all of the right and important topics, the things that we should all be thinking about and talking about as we try to make further progress on measuring intangibles. And I truly think that the discussion in the next couple of days is going to be really helpful in kind of setting our path going forward. So those were final thoughts. Here are final thoughts. Coming back to my initial graphics. So I thought, all right, since I talked for kind of a long time and it went on and on a bit, I thought I'd boil it all down to just a haiku of 17 syllables. So here it is. This is all you need to remember of everything I said. You cannot touch this, but we all can measure that. Yes, intangibles. So that's it. Thanks. Thanks very much for your attention.
Thank you very much for a fascinating talk. It was really nice to see John Kendrick mentioned.
Yeah.
I think he was ahead of his time in lots of areas, not just in intangibles, but also measuring human capital, and someone who doesn't get cited enough for his contributions. So that was nice. Right, so we're going to take some questions. We'll take some from the people here on the floor, and then we'll take some from Zoom. If you want to ask a question on Zoom, please just put your question in the Q&A and I will have to read it out because technology doesn't quite work well enough to bring you into this hybrid situation. So, okay, so we can start. And as you ask a question, could you please say your name and your affiliation? Although I think we all know who Leonard is.
You're gonna microphone just a second.
I'm Leonard Nakamura. I'm emeritus at the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia. I actually just want to make a comment about the water and diamonds thing, which is that we're in the information age, the knowledge age, right? And the way I think about this is that we're in a rising ocean of knowledge in which we all as individuals are little tiny islands and we're all drowning in the ocean. And that's, you know, a fundamental problem for our economy, that we have so much knowledge and it's harder and harder for each of us to stay at the frontier of that knowledge.
Jonathan, I think you're up.
No, you're first. Sorry.
All right, go ahead.
Jennifer Salorzano from Imperial College London. My question is about the last part about households, intangibles assets. And my question is, how do you distinguish this kind of innovation from household perspective from the startups? Because this is how they initiate it. How is measuring the same? It's like, so you consider the young and small firms as the households, and those then are the most intangible kind of firms. So how do you make the distinction? Yeah, so as I mentioned, the measurement challenges in getting just given data availability, they're big measurement challenges. Eric von Hippel over the years has run a number of surveys in many, I think now in more than 10 countries, where it's done surveys to try to identify household innovation. And it's done in a way that one, asks people to do things that they're not doing for part of a business. So we're trying to strip out things that are really the beginnings of a business. So it's things you're doing for kind of your own reward rather than that you're starting a business. So a set of questions to try to identify that set of activities. You know, I almost put up on the screen Apple Computer, because of course that started as kind of a garage vanity project that then turned into Apple Computer, but that really did end up being a startup. So that really we're not counting. We're counting things other than that, and things like the artificial pancreas, which, you know, was not part of a business venture. There's also a lot of work in those surveys to try to weed out or eliminate things like
somebody who's just home kind of casually writing music and then posting it on the internet. So it's done, it's survey based, and the survey questions are designed to identify a certain category of items. But boy, more work and more effort to try to refine those categories and those measurements, it would be great.
I think I'll take Jonathan next, and then I think I'll go on the Zoom after this. And then...
Jonathan Haskell, Imperial College. Thanks very much, Dan. It's a fantastic talk. Three quick, comments and questions. One is on the software issue. I think when this was originally being thought about, the view was that once software became a service, everything would just be much easier, because it would just be much easier to measure the service flow rather than the dreadful potential double counting problem of the double counting of the investment. I wonder if you could comment on that. Second is the household innovation thing is really interesting because of course it fits very nicely with the working from home kind of post-COVID equilibrium and raises all these difficult questions, not only about expanding the asset boundary, but about expanding the production boundary as well. And then the third thing is just on a more sort of general thing about the priorities of statistical agencies. Of course, part of all of this work comes as an attempt to make GDP more relevant. And I think that wave of criticism of GDP will start all over again with renewed vigor as we go more towards climate and green and so forth, and the notion that GDP is inaccurate, not only for the types of reasons which CHS pointed out, but for those other reasons as well. So I think it's another part, this is more a comment, forgive me. I think it's another part of the kind of renewing GDP and keeping that momentum going in the wave, in the face of those criticisms. Thanks, Dan.
All right, thanks, Jonathan. Just quick comment. On software as a service, agree that I think the measurement gets easier if everything is subscription based for software, gets much easier to measure. I think there's still a question of when we do growth accounting, how we want to think about how those payments fit in and what we're going to count as a purchase of software or not. So I think there's still some growth accounting issues to think about, but I completely agree with you there. Nice observation on household innovation. And I'm really glad you brought up the point about kind of environmental accounting, environmental measurement. It's not something I've worked on, so I didn't bring it into this talk, but completely agree that it's front and center and for statistical agencies, a really important priority for all the reasons that you said.
Okay, sorry, Rachel Soloveitchik also talks about the software. I'm not sure there's actually a question here, Rachel, but maybe a comment. She says the software measurement question is very interesting. I think the BEA's accounts assume that all software spending is investment, but one major issue is that the exact payment arrangement for the same asset shouldn't matter to GDP, but company accounts might not be invariant to the payment arrangement. So I think this is an issue. Quite an important measurement issue that Rachel has brought up. I don't know if you want to say anything about that.
I agree. I think it is it's a really important measurement issue and some hard things to figure out with as service payments for subscriptions or services payments for software, thinking through what's in the data source and how that feeds through into the national accounts. I think Rachel's right on target and thinking we need to get that right.
Joe, do you want to go next?
Joe Grice, I'm sort of tempted to say emeritus ONS, but I was very struck by one point you made forcefully, but actually didn't cover too much of your overall talk. And that is there's kind of an elision between talking about capital as investment, or flow, which is what a lot of the effort has been about, and genuine capital, which of course is a stock, in which case depreciation and obsolescence becomes absolutely crucial. And one imagine this area that the rates of depreciation and obsolescence are generally pretty high, not always, presumably depreciation on invented calculus is rather low, but for the most part, you'd expect the depreciation rates to be very high. So I just wonder if you have a feel, as I do, that rather than thinking about more and more and more and more concepts that we can measure as a flow and adding to a satellite account or whatever, we should actually be putting more effort into calculation of genuine stocks, the genuine capital, because for many reasons, many purposes, not least explaining productivity growth, it seems to me the stock is likely to be at least as important as the flow. I wonder if you think that's a fair point and whether indeed it should affect the priorities for the work going forward in this area.
Thanks very much for that. I think it is a fair point. And I didn't work out the structure in the talk, but if one thinks about, here's a category of intangible capital that we all agree ought to be included in national accounts. To do that in a full way, of course, you need the investment flow. You need to convert that to real units, real pounds, euros, dollars. And then if you want to get stocks through the way that statistical agencies have typically done it, you need a depreciation rate to do perpetual inventory method. And I highlighted, the importance of the work on depreciation rates. It's really hard. I think a little progress has been made in the last couple decades, but not a lot. And that is front and center to your point. Now, I suppose an alternative way of approaching it would be to actually survey companies and ask them what is the capital stock that you have as compared to doing a perpetual inventory method. That comes with its own set of challenges in getting companies to write down what national income accountants would want them to write down. So I think I'm pretty comfortable with the perpetual inventory approach, but it does require having reliable depreciation rates, which is a huge challenge.
Absolutely. Yes. Okay. Bart, I think, was next. And then Paul.
Thanks, Dan. As always, very interesting. So first of all, I would be interesting to hear what your thinking is about that sort of boom in publications in the early 20th century. What is that about? What did I write about? Maybe you have anything on that. But I really want to continue this software discussion. I'm sorry, Mary, because I do think you make a really important point there. And I tend to disagree a little bit with your discussion that this makes things easier. If service as a software becomes an intermediate input, right? Because that's basically what it now means. Subscription becomes part of intermediate input, so you're not accumulating it. But it is non-rival us, as you just said. So it should create spillovers, right? So here's an intermediate input that we're not going to accumulate anymore as an investment, but we do assume it creates spillovers because otherwise it wouldn't be non-rival us. So I wonder what your thinking is. I think this makes the accounting actually awfully complicated, but I think it's very important because software as a service has become such an important share of overall software that if you take it out of the investment, actually software may go down as an investment. It may fall. So, but service as a software is a very big thing for intangibles. So I wonder what your thinking is. And then finally, if you have time, if Mary allows you to speak to that, do you think that actually household intangibles have increased during the pandemic?
Yeah, okay. Thanks, Bart. All really interesting. On the boom in the early 20th century, I only did the most cursory look. I was really struck by the chart. A lot of it had to do with tax treatment of intangibles, so from the accounting side. And a lot of it, I think, was just, again, 1920s, 1930s, 1920s, new economy, stock market going up like mad. So if you think about a stock market valuation of intangibles, it would look like that's really big and important. And so I think it was around those things, but there's a lot more digging that could be done there. On software as a service, so you've raised, I think, a really interesting dichotomy. I think from just strictly a measurement point of view of getting what is the value of software, that, or the expenditure, measuring the expenditure on software. I think in some respects it is easier because maybe there's less own account software and more that is a market mediated transaction. And in that sense, I think the measurement of outlays becomes a bit easier. I think you're quite right. And that was part of on the point that then how we want to think about the implications of that for productivity growth or economic growth does get very complicated and very hard. And that's much of what Kortum and Eaton are trying to do, is to say, hey, maybe this is a bit more complicated. And not only does one want to think of it as non-rivalrous, but if one does that, then you have to think about the spillovers. And I think it makes growth accounting harder than just taking a Cobb Douglas production function and differentiating and then applying some statistics to it. So I think on the one hand, easier, on the other hand, harder for the reasons that you said. Household intangibles, my intuition would be that it has increased. People have had more time at home to do some of these things. That being said, one of the problems is that we don't know very much. Eric von Hippel has done these surveys in a number of countries, but they're one-shot deals, and they never had the funding to do them repeatedly. So we really don't have much of a time series. And so while my intuition goes that way, I think the answer is we just don't know. We don't have the data to answer that question.
Paul,
University of Nottingham. Quick question again about the software as a service and intangibles boundary, and thinking about where we put boundaries for different things. When we think about intangible investment, do we count that as a form of, are we correctly measuring it as a form of capital, or is it actually really adoption of new technology? And so there's the question when we're measuring it, whether we should be putting it into, in growth accounting terms, into A rather than K. But there's also the question of interactions between the two. So is it the case that we need to invest in intangible capital in order to take advantage of the technological progress, and there's some kind of interaction between them rather than separating them out as two different things?
Really interesting observation. Thanks for that. So a couple of really interesting issues there. One is this question of how do we want to think about outlays for new intangible capital, new software? Do we want to think of it as investment? Do we want to think of it as intermediate input that maybe has some very important spillover? So that's one set of questions. And then the other is, right, the linkage between multi-factor productivity and investment, and what are the spillovers, and trying to identify those linkages there. And both of those, I think, are really important questions to work out. And we're going to learn a little bit more about them in the next couple of days, I think.
so can I take the two questions, one from Richard and then Hanu together? And then I have one question here from Sanjeev, which I think will end this.
Perfect. Perfect.
Richard Hayes, ONS. It struck me thinking about the depreciation topic that you were discussing. Essentially, depreciation is a very physical concept to think about for an intangible asset. It's a very tangible way of thinking about it. And I often wonder whether actually we should be better off thinking about the fall of value of intangibles as a revaluation process rather than a depreciation process. If a line of software code depreciates, it would go rapidly to zero. It would become worthless because it doesn't work unless it's complete. And so for me, it is part of the problem of depreciation simply because it's maybe the wrong concept or the wrong way to think about that challenge.
Hanu, yeah.
Hannu Piekkola from University of Vaasa, Helsinki, also coordinator of Global Into project funded by the European Union. So we have registered data about public sector intangibles or public sector occupations, remote access to occupations. That would be one way to measure intangibles in the public sector, because you have R&D staff. And in Finland, in particular, in the last 10 years, the share of R&D staff have decreased by 30%. So measuring through occupational data, you can see how much of the savings in the public sector can happen through savings in research institutes, by savings in universities, and all the important institutes related to healthcare also. So this kinds of downgrading of public sector intangible activity that happens is usually observed nowhere. And for Finland, that's much more important. At the same time, the politicians are worried about R&D in private sector, that you should put more money to the big companies who have money already enough. So this measuring public sector intangibles, perhaps through occupational data, if that's possible, would be very much needed to have an overall picture of the total intangibles. So that's my comment.
You want to
Sure.
respond?
Thanks for that. seems like a really interesting insight into ways of some different ways of measuring public sector intangibles, and sounds like something I want to take a look at and see what you're see more of what you're doing. On the depreciation point, so I think of depreciation, you know, there's if we think about depreciation is one of these topics, right, where the definitions over the decades have ebbed and flowed and been very controversial. So there's depreciation in the sense of physical depreciation of a machine wearing out over time. There's depreciation in the sense of obsolescence of, just as you were describing, just it still works, but nobody wants to use it, and so its value has fallen. And I think in the US, the concept of depreciation in the national accounts is really more the full decline in value rather than, at least in concept, doesn't always get there in exact implementation, but in concept, it's the full decline in value. And plenty of efforts to measure depreciation have been based on looking at used asset prices. So let's look at a personal computer that's same model but 1 year old versus one that's new today, and how has the value changed, and then using that kind of information to extract measures of depreciation in that more broadly construed way. So that strikes me as a really valuable and important way to move forward. I think the challenge for intangibles is how you get, there isn't always going to be a used asset market for intangibles in a way that's going to make it those kinds of data readily available. But to the extent that they are, that seems like just a brilliant way to go at it.
Okay, so I have one question, quite a long question from Sanjeev, but just to paraphrase, it's about the history of capitalizing R&D and other forms of intangibles, that it all started discussion as far back as 1968, a very heated discussion in 1993, he says. And NSOs face a lot of constraints in terms of getting these things in, so into national accounts. So his question is, which intangible category would you prioritize top of your list? And I think that's a good place to end.
Specifically with respect to depreciation, or just
with respect to including them in national accounts.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So I think I would come to so I think value of data, databases seems like one where I think it's possible to make some progress, and that I think would be very important to include, and where I think there's some sort of prototypes for how to do that. I think the next ones on my list would be thinking about advertising, brand equity, which has its challenges, because when that gets talked about in a broader public forum, there's a lot of resistance to that. So I think there'd be some work to do on the language that gets used to describe that. But I think that's a category that, again, I think there's kind of a template in a way that could be done. And then I'm really interested in the managerial organizational capital category. But there, I think there's still quite a bit of disagreement about the best ways to measure that in a way that would work well in a national account setting.
Okay, so I mean, I would think the firm-specific human capital, the training, should be something that's easy enough to incorporate as well. And of course, I have a lot of interest in skills and training.
So Mary, you raised an interesting point. I didn't talk about human capital particularly. Again, not an area I've worked on, but yeah. I agree with you. Really, really important. Completely agree.
Okay. So on that note, we'll close the procedures again. Thank Dan for doing the stimulation. And now we have a break with coffee downstairs, and back again on for the plenary session at 11:15. And please do come back on time.